Today, we're going to take a quick look at the origins of the Imperial Japanese Navy, courtesy of a vote on Patreon. Now, this might seem a little bit of an odd choice, but the Imperial Japanese Navy is one of the few navies where you can actually look at the relatively rapid rise of a blue water navy from practically nothing to major world player in the span of a few decades. Much older navies, like the British, French, or Spanish fleets, well, you'd need to cover several centuries to reach similar points, and even the comparatively recent US Navy only really emerged onto the global stage as a long-term fixture well over a century after its founding, occasional ventures to the Barbary Coast, or as we'll see here, to Japan, aside. Japan, as either an island full of competing states or as a unified political entity, has a long but varied relationship with the sea. Coastal warships were a consistent theme for well over 1,500 years, with occasional construction of larger fleets either for periodic invasions of mainland Asia or in response to invasions coming from mainland Asia. It looked like a permanent blue water navy might arise in the early 1600s, when a number of new ships were constructed that blended the techniques of European galleons, which had been visiting to trade, with local construction styles and materials to produce hybrid but entirely capable vessels. But a few decades later, the Tokugawa shogunate imposed a policy of seclusion, with outside contact limited to a very few selected ports. This brought an end to any developing Japanese naval traditions, but it allowed Japan to remain at least somewhat aware of the general goings-on in the wider world, which would include technological developments. This pattern continued for several hundred years until the 19th century, when a series of incidents began to challenge Japanese isolationism. Most of these were conducted by various American and European vessels who were trying to force trade to open up, as at this point trade with Japan was restricted to Dutch vessels only. There was also the occasional shipwreck, and a few sneaky ships, such as a British frigate in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, that pretended to be Dutch in order to get into a port that it thought there were Dutch merchant ships in. All of this in turn led to an escalation of the isolationist measures, with Japanese gun batteries ordered to fire on any ship that got in range of them that wasn't flying a Dutch flag. And gradually attempts got more and more forceful. With the First Opium War having managed to partially open up China to Western trade, the idea of sailing up with a lot of guns and just flat out ordering the Japanese, with a few diplomatic niceties papered over the top, to allow foreign ships to trade with them became more and more popular. An early attempt at this occurred in 1846, where Commodore James Biddle took the 92-gun ship of the line USS Columbus and the much smaller sloop USS Vincennes into Japanese waters to request a trade treaty similar to that which the US had recently signed with China. To be clear, these various attempts were not general, you should really open yourself up to the wider world of trade style embassies. They were, you should specifically trade with us and maybe also kick the Dutch out, which was in true mercantilist tradition, which was in vogue at the time. In this particular case, Biddle was politely but firmly told to get stuffed and go away, but in the next decade, Commodore Matthew Perry famously arrived for the first time in late 1853 with orders to force Japan to trade with the USA, whether it liked it or not. The or not part was backed up by a fleet that, at least on paper, consisted of 3 steam frigates, 3 sailing warships, and 3 steam storeships that had all been armed. Arriving off the Japanese capital with 2 of the steam frigates and 2 sailing vessels, Perry's force quickly acquired the local nickname of the Black Ships due to their hull colour, although, to be fair, they were also present to seize highly valuable commodities by use of force if needed, so parallels with other things aside. Whilst Japan had stayed roughly up to date with Western technology, they hadn't updated their own equipment at quite the same rate. And to be fair, by the mid-19th century, naval technology was advancing so quickly that even if they'd updated their coastal batteries 5 years ago, they might well be obsolete by now. This technological advantage allowed Perry to demand his message be delivered directly to the shogun, on the essential grounds of what else are you going to do about it? The Japanese, rapidly appreciating that their capital's defences had nothing with which to repel Perry's squadron should they choose to actually force the issue, resulted in the message being duly delivered. With that done, Perry headed off for China, saying that they'd be back later for an answer. The Japanese government, which was currently actually without a leader as the current shogun had inconveniently chosen that year to begin dying in earnest, was somewhat unsure of what to do, except that it was clear that Japan had currently no way to resist American military efforts if it came down to that. But they also realised there were plenty of other European powers who would jump in immediately if the US efforts were seen to bear unconditional fruit. Thus, even before Perry's return, significant shore batteries were ordered to be constructed, as well as orders for ocean-going warships to be built. The general order against building ocean-going warships had actually been rescinded at the end of 1852 at the prompting of the forward-looking lord of the Satsuma clan, who had already started building a small sailing frigate, ostensibly to protect Japan's claims to various outlying islands, but now other warships would be rapidly laid down as well. Shortly after Perry left, the Russians showed up with a similar idea, but with slightly fewer ships, which also ended up later on getting sunk in a tsunami, and as an overall result, they were making somewhat slower progress with their negotiations. Thus, having collected more of his fleet actually with him, Perry made tracks back for Japan again, arriving in February 1854, and despite their preparations, the Japanese government had come to the ultimate conclusion that they were going to accept most of the American demands, although there would be a lot of negotiation and such like for show. After all due ceremony, Perry left with certain ports now open to American trade and plenty of gifts both for the nation and personally in late March 1854. Later on in the year, the British showed up with a force roughly similar to Perry's, and they ended up with a treaty that partially opened Japan to them as well, which was to be expanded to a trade treaty a few years later. Although, bizarrely, in this case, the treaty was actually the result of a series of catastrophic misunderstandings. The British, who were aware of the Russian ships being present in Japanese ports, as this was just before the tsunami that would wreck them, wanted to destroy them, as the Crimean War had kicked off and they were now on opposite sides, but they also wanted to ensure that Japan would remain neutral and not support Russian efforts in the Pacific. The Japanese, seeing a small British fleet show up only a few months after Perry had left, and rather painfully aware of what the British had done to China in the First Opium War, assumed that they were there for a similar treaty to the one they just concluded with the Americans, and thanks to some rather dodgy translators, the British came away with a basic access treaty to Japanese ports and waters and a slightly bewildered air about what exactly had just happened. The next year, the Japanese finally allowed the Russians to trade with them as well, and thus was the beginning of the end for Japanese isolationism. As the various sailing frigates laid down in 1853 and 1854 came into service, it was clear that they would not suffice against the larger shell-firing steamships of the foreign navies, and with the trade treaties being fairly unequal in favour of the foreign powers, as most treaties negotiated at the barrel of a gun tend to be, the Japanese determined that they should build up their own strength to be able to play on a more equal footing. But, since Japan lacked large-scale steam engine building infrastructure, orders went out to rectify this problem as well. But, in the interim, whilst that was all being sorted, foreign warships would have to be purchased, which could also then be analysed to accelerate the understanding of these technologies. For this, the Japanese turned to their oldest trading partners, the Dutch, acquiring the paddle-driven Kanko Maru in 1855 and then the screw-driven Kanrin Maru in 1857. This latter vessel was then sent over to visit the US 3 years later as part of Japan's negotiating strategy for an updated treaty, the idea being to emphasise that Japan now possessed similar naval technology to that of foreign nations and thus should be treated more equally. Both engineers and ship designers, as well as prospective naval officers, were duly dispatched to various Western nations to learn about the latest in technology and tactics, as this was seen as a very rapidly developing field, although delegations to the United States were cancelled due to the outbreak of the American Civil War. All of these efforts bore fruit when, in 1863, Japan launched its first home-built steam warship, the Chiyoda Gata, a small gunboat. And before anyone jumps all over me going, but gata is Japanese for class, yes, she was originally supposed to be Chiyoda and the lead ship in a class of gunboat, but she ended up being the only one, so she was just renamed Chiyoda Gata instead until she was eventually sold out of service. But if you want, you can refer to her as Chiyoda, which of course would be reused in several Japanese warships going forward. During the 1860s, Japan was trying to balance its relationships with various major foreign powers, and as an example of this, you can look at the on-again, off-again relationship it had with the British. On the one hand, the shogunate asked them to help repel Russian encroachment on Japanese territory up in the north, which the Royal Navy, fresh off the Crimean War and thus no fan of the Russians, was all too eager to help out with. But on the other hand, you had incidents like the bombardment of Kagoshima, where a Royal Navy squadron tried to exact compensation for the murder of a British merchant from the Satsuma domain, although that wasn't helped by the hopeless inaccuracy of the new Armstrong 110-pounder, which managed to hit the city surrounding the castle more than the castle itself, which was what the guns were actually aimed at. This slightly weird relationship with the UK, and indeed a number of other foreign powers, was as much due to various local Japanese authorities pretty much playing their own game as much as it was the shogunate trying to balance everything out. The mid-1860s would see further conflict break out, reflecting the failing power of the shogun as the various domains, which were essentially the states that formed Japan as a whole in a still approximately feudal format, began to take action completely independently of central authority due to various disputes over whether foreign influence was a good thing or not. The backlash against foreign trade culminated in the emperor himself ordering all foreigners expelled, which promptly saw the British, French, Dutch and Americans cooperate and coordinate against the Choshu domain's forces, who were seen as one of the main drivers of this idea, and that saw a clash between the US frigate Wyoming and a number of Choshu warships, the American ship winning, albeit damaged, and managing to sink a couple of Japanese vessels into the bargain, although since the whole conflict took place in shallow water, those Japanese ships could subsequently be refloated, the overall conflict ending in victory for the foreign alliance. The later 1860s saw a brief civil war in Japan, the Boshin War, otherwise known as the Meiji Restoration, which led to the fall of the shogunate and the resumption of the emperor taking a more direct role in government. The war occurring at pretty much the same time as the previous emperor conveniently died, which meant that although the imperial forces won the war, the new emperor, Meiji, and his government would actually take up many of the more open policies of the shogunate, which the rebellion, which had placed the imperial family back more in control, had actually largely been against. The two major clans involved, on the winning side, the Choshu and the Satsuma, would later, roughly speaking, come to dominate the two new imperial forces that were created out of the conflict, the Choshu dominating the Imperial Japanese Army, and the Satsuma formed a good portion of the newly formed Imperial Japanese Navy, perhaps understandable since their territory consisted of much of the southwestern tip of the home islands, which necessarily exposed them far more to maritime interests than elsewhere. Of course, having your two major armed services dominated by clans who'd spent centuries glaring and occasionally shooting at each other over the Kyushu Straits couldn't possibly go wrong in the future at all, could it? Anyway, the Boshin War had seen the debut of the Imperial Japanese Navy as an organization in combat. Early on, encounters like the Battle of Awa had seen the two sides use a mixture of ships that just belonged to whichever domain supported them. In that case, the Satsuma domain paddle steamer Kasuga had fought against the screw steamer Kaio Maru, a relatively recent addition to the Japanese inventory. But that had been followed by the arrival of two more shogunate warships, the Banryu and the Shokaku, and now facing 3-1 odds, the Kasuga was forced to retreat. Thus, one of the transports that it was escorting was lost. But it was also a notable encounter in that one of her gunners would eventually climb the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Navy to eventually lead it at the Battle of Tsushima. He would of course be better known to history by his name and rank in that conflict, Admiral Togo. By the end of the conflict, though, with the remnant shogunate forces having fallen back to form the short-lived Izo Republic, the various domain warships had been collected into the Imperial Japanese Navy, least on paper, and at the Battle of Hakodate, about a month before the final end of the war, not only was Togo once again taking part aboard the Kasuga, but, as you might already have recognized from the previous battle, the Imperial Japanese Navy was starting out its history with a number of ships whose names would be repeated down through the years of its subsequent building programs, as this battle saw the Chiyoda, Hiryu, Kaiyu, and Kaiten all present, albeit some of them were temporarily on the other side. Also notable was the deployment by the Japanese Navy of the ironclad Kotetsu, formerly the CSS Stonewall, which had been on its way to join the Confederate States Navy when the American Civil War had ended. The US had then sold her, ironically enough, to the shogunate, and by the time she arrived in Japan, the Imperial government had managed to secure the bulk of the home islands, and thus the ship turned up late to its owners once more, and so entered Japanese Navy service instead. She would be renamed to Azuma a couple of years later, as Kotetsu literally translates to ironclad, and the Japanese Navy realized they probably wanted more than one, and just having Kotetsu 2, Kotetsu 3, and Kotetsu 4, etc., sounded a little bit silly. Whilst this conflict had illustrated how in just over a decade Japan had gone from precisely 0 modern warships to several dozen mixed screw and paddle-driven steam warships, a few sailing ships, and an ironclad or two, it was still a relatively small service. The first Imperial Japanese Naval Review contained more than half a dozen ships, but their total combined displacement was exceeded by a single French warship who'd showed up to watch. The respective flagships at Hakodate had been between 1,000 and 2,000 tons displacement each, in a world where the larger navies had been deploying ships displacing over 10,000 tons for several years. Post-war, the Imperial Japanese Navy was much more heavily centralized. It had existed in theory, as we mentioned, in the latter stages of the war, but the final end of the domains as semi-independent mini-states in 1871 is sometimes seen as a more formal case for its establishment in truth. There would be further internal unrest as it became clear that the new emperor was much less keen on kicking out all foreigners and going back into isolation compared to his father. But, from the government's perspective, one of the top priorities was to level the playing field in the realm of foreign trade. The first treaties of the 1850s were largely incredibly lopsided in favour of the various foreign powers, as we've already said, because at the time they'd held all the guns. But in order to challenge these and renegotiate the terms of them, Japan needed a credible deterrent against further gunboat diplomacy. Whether this would come from the Navy or the Army was almost immediately a matter of contention. Ships were what had precipitated the last 2 decades of arguments and conflict, and ships could stop an enemy force before they even got to Japan. But, on the other hand, ships were very expensive, and if they didn't stop the enemy, then shore batteries and large armies were more likely to succeed against any incoming force, which of necessity would likely be hugely outnumbered and at the tail end of a very long supply line. At first, the Navy won out in this argument. In 1870, the Emperor had decreed that the Japanese Navy should fashion itself after the largest and most powerful navy on the planet, that being, of course, the British Royal Navy. And there were equally grand plans for a fleet of 200 ships, which would be divided into 10 fleets, each about 20 ships strong, manned by a total of 20,000 sailors, all of which would be built over the next 20 years. Although, given that this averages to about 100 crewmen per ship, assuming that everybody is on a ship and not manning dockyards and so forth, there can't have been that many larger vessels envisaged in this fleet. But, as would occur several times in the Imperial Japanese Navy's history, the vision was considerably larger than the economy and dockyard capacity of Japan could actually maintain, and this idea was quickly dropped. Although the British-built small ironclads Fuso, Kongo, and Hiei would turn up on the Imperial Japanese Navy's muster rolls over the next few years, alongside locally built sloops and corvettes like the Amagi, Tenryu, Katsuragi, Yamato, and Musashi, together with gunboats, also built in Japanese yards, which included such vessels as Maya, Akagi, Atago, and Chokai. But the lack of any immediate Western navies trying to reimpose their will on Japan, combined with the aforementioned internal uprisings, which are of course much more of an army matter than a navy one, although the navy did supply transport, logistics, and bombardment where necessary, plus the economic limitations of the Japanese economy, would see the pendulum swing away from the Navy in the mid-1870s. In some ways, the internal debates in Japan about what the Navy should do were also proxies of the British and French ideas of naval policy, as both nations had extensive military missions or embassies based in the country. The British mostly focusing on helping to build up the Imperial Japanese Navy into a miniature Royal Navy in terms of tradition, tactics, and style, and the French mostly focusing on the army but advocating for a largely coastal defence naval force, which suited their own ideas better. Whilst never directly subservient to the army, the Imperial Japanese Navy thus gradually slipped into second place in the overall consideration for national defence, a position in which it would remain for much of the 19th century. That isn't to say that the Imperial Japanese Navy was idle. Despite mainly looking at how to build up and defend Japan, the government was also not averse to a little bit of overseas adventurism, turning the tables in terms of gunboat diplomacy by sending the Japanese Navy out to force Korea to open up to Japan in a similar way to what the Western powers had done to Japan itself a few decades earlier. Other expeditions mildly expanded Japanese territory, such as forcing China to cede its claims to the Ryukyu Islands, which had previously been in something of a balance between Japan and China. And in the early 1870s, when the imperial government was perhaps running a little bit high on their success in the Boshin War, they'd even contemplated outright invading Korea, although they were eventually talked out of it, at least for the moment. Back at home, the Navy was organising itself into an organisation students of World War II Japanese naval doctrine will be fairly familiar with a series of what were called Chinjufu established. I think that's how it's pronounced anyway. These were distinct naval districts, which would each have a headquarters, slipways, dry docks, depots, warehouses, etc., etc. Essentially, each one would be capable of fully constructing, maintaining, supplying, and organising a small fleet in and of itself. The first two would be Yokohama and Nagasaki, with Yokohama's status moving over to Yokosuka in 1884. The Imperial Japanese Navy also spent much of the 1870s sorting out its officer corps and its training from the mishmash of various domain officers who had been grandfathered into the service into something that was a little bit more coherent, as mentioned, using the British model. Although by the end of the decade, both the British and French military missions gradually left Japan, as Japan was now relying more and more on its own internal methodologies. Although sending officers abroad for training and bringing in individual subject matter experts and small-scale military missions would continue for several more decades, as would the practice of ordering some of its largest warships from foreign yards, at least until the local ones could catch up. The 1880s would also see a number of other changes. The Japanese stopped ordering or constructing anything that wasn't steam-powered and at least iron-hulled, and they began to divest themselves of any remaining sail-powered or wooden-hulled vessels already in service. In 1883, a large naval expansion plan was approved as the Navy's political representation was on the rise, but whilst British influence had been strong, and would remain so in areas such as officer training, Japan had always kept open relations with France as well. French assistance had, for example, been key in the building of the Yokosuka dockyards. So whilst 1883 would see the ordering of two superb vessels of the new protected or Elzec cruiser type from British yards, the Naniwa and Takachiho, the rise of French designs in the 1880s generally across the world, courtesy of Émile Bertin, combined with an arms race with China kicking off, which meant that when French naval theories began advocating for the jeune école style of warfare, the Japanese took one look at their economy compared to that of China, at least on paper, and decided that whilst China seemed to be going the traditional route, with ironclad battleships like the Dingyuan and Zhenyuan being ordered, the idea of a force that was made up largely of cheap torpedo boats and cruisers designed either for commerce raiding or somehow able to take on ships many times their size, which would also be cheaper than battleships, appealed greatly. And so the Imperial Japanese Navy pivoted its fleet plans to follow the French model, complete with actually bringing Émile Bertin himself over to design cruisers for them for a few years, as well as some smaller ships. This primarily led to the construction of the Matsushima-class cruisers, along with aforementioned smaller vessels. The Matsushimas were a force which was supposed to be 4 ships strong, eventually cut down to 3, and they were supposed to be able to be in many places at once in peacetime, or, if they were fighting smaller opponents, but if faced with larger and more powerful enemies, could essentially become a pre-dreadnought by forming up some kind of nautical conga line / Voltron, which would allow them to bring 4 big guns to bear, but with each mounted on separate hulls, each of which were also equipped with extensive secondary batteries. They should, in theory, be able to provide more overall firepower than a single battleship, combined with more resilience, because even if you managed to sink one of them, there would be 3 others shooting at you, and to this end, the 2 of them were supposed to have forward-firing main guns, and the other 2 were supposed to have rear-firing main guns. As it turned out, apart from the last one being cancelled, which left them with the forward-firing Itsukushima and Hashidate, and the rather lonely now aft-firing Matsushima, the cruisers also turned out to be poorly protected, never reached their target speed, their machinery plants took more off days than a teenage anarchist forced into their first job by their parents, and trying to manage such a large gun, the 65-ton 320mm or 12.6-inch Kane weapon, on a vessel that barely broke 4,000 tons proved to be incredibly difficult, which slowed the already slow rate of fire quite considerably, which wasn't helped by the training of the gun to port or starboard, causing the ship to heel in that direction, which completely threw off all the elevation calculations. This caused the Imperial Japanese Navy to decide that, whilst they were going to continue with the je ne sais idea for the moment, as much for economy reasons as anything else, they were going to back off the French-inspired shipbuilding for a little bit, instead reverting over to the UK for their next big protected cruiser, the Yoshino. The fact that the French-built protected cruiser Unebi just straight up vanished en route to Japan didn't help matters in this regard, especially when suspicion about her instability became the leading theory for her loss, a decade and a half after HMS Captain had taught the Royal Navy that same lesson. The torpedo boats, however, remained largely French-influenced. They were small and fast, and excellent at coastal defence, but they'd need a tow, or ideally wholesale transport, if they were taken overseas. But the Japanese Navy would keep its eye on the ball in this field as well, ordering the larger Kotaka from the British in the latter part of the 1880s. Whilst Kotaka was a bit slower, she was considerably larger and more heavily armed than her other torpedo boat compatriots, and critically was therefore capable of limited overseas operations independently. In some ways, something of a forerunner to the torpedo boat destroyers that were soon to come. One thing that the Imperial Japanese Navy did fully adopt from their brief French period of larger ship design was the appeal of quick-firing guns. Indeed, the Japanese Navy was one of the first navies to fully embrace this new technology, which allowed them to build a fleet that was centered around torpedo attacks and saturation fire from small and medium-caliber quick-firing weapons, with the coup de grace coming from the big guns on the Matsushimas at the end of the battle, which was presumably roughly when Japanese high command reckoned the crews would have figured out how to aim the blasted things properly. As tension with China grew, more and more ships were ordered. Internally, the Japanese Navy was edging back towards a traditional battle fleet concept, but finances and inertia had kept them largely on the jeune école path for now. The ordering of the early armoured cruiser Chiyoda from the UK in 1889, showing something of a bridge in thinking of the time. The Imperial Japanese Navy was also agitating to be able to move out of its heretofore semi-subordinate role to the army, which was helped by a groundswell of public approval, partially due to the grandeur of some of the new ships, which were much easier to admire than random marching columns of infantry, and partially due to the concerns about China, which had been stoked by the visits of Chinese warships to Japanese ports. As the 1890s dawned, the Japanese Navy was thus finally able to somewhat move out of the Japanese Army's shadow, getting their own independent naval general staff. But the Army would still have overall control of national defence as a whole, whilst the Japanese Navy was left solely with maritime defence, a much narrower purview. So, whilst more independent, the ascendancy of the Navy was not yet quite complete. But it wouldn't be long in coming. The Japanese Navy's staff, often being led by the then Captain Yamamoto Gonbi, or Gombe, I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce the Japanese characters there, who was no relation, incidentally, to Yamamoto Isoroku, who at this stage was not even a teenager, and indeed not even a Yamamoto at this point. The earlier Yamamoto had a very good set of wits about him. In a conference shortly before the outbreak of the latest episode of Sino-Japanese hostilities, he was getting a bit fed up of an army general who was regaling everybody with why the entire war would be decided by a land battle in Korea. So he asked the army general, "Do the army have any good engineering units?" When the irritated general said, "Well, of course we do," and then demanded to know why Yamamoto wanted to know this, Yamamoto responded, "Because, General, if the army is going to get to Korea without the Imperial Japanese Navy, those engineer units are going to have to build a very long bridge." Presumably followed by Jeremy Clarkson's smugface. It was in this increasingly fractious environment that the Sino-Japanese War 1894 edition broke out, and whilst this war, which is where we're going to draw a line under this brief narrative, would pit the Jeune École fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy against the more traditionally managed Chinese Navy, and comprehensively end the Japanese brief flirtation with the Jeune École school of thought, within the Japanese Navy itself, there was actually already movement to head back towards a more British model for the fleet in totality. This is perhaps best represented by the Fuji-class pre-dreadnoughts. The visit of the Chinese Dingyuan class had led to a request for a pair of battleships as early as 1891 to match them, but internal politics meant that these requests were constantly getting rejected until the Emperor himself offered, in early 1893, to pay for them out of his own funds if the government couldn't get its house in order. Partially to avoid the dishonour of being schooled by the Emperor like a bunch of fractious schoolchildren, and partially because this request would also entail a 10% salary cut to their own wages, the government suddenly found it was entirely possible to approve the procurement of ships from the regular budget. Full-scale battleships were of course an early sign of the rejection of the Jeune École, but by the time the design had been completed and orders placed, in the UK as Japanese yards weren't quite yet up to building warships of this scale, the war had already started, and would indeed be over before the two ships were even launched, let alone commissioned. So the Imperial Japanese Navy would have to fight its first true overseas war with a fleet whose tactical doctrine it was already part way to rejecting. But that wraps up our look at the beginnings of the Imperial Japanese Navy. I've honestly no idea when we're going to look at the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 itself, as the sources for what exactly happened in this naval aspect of the conflict are still incredibly inconsistent, but, as always, that will be a story for another day.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.